If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to Hosea chapter 2. So you got Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea. One of the what's known as the minor prophets. Don't really understand why they call them that, other than they're not the biggies, I suppose. Their books are rather short, and that's got something to do with it. But in our lives as believers, it seems to me that we misinterpret, or I would say misrepresent, the gospel in many ways in our culture right now. Some will say that the gospel is going to get saved and your life will be better. Well, I think that's true. I wouldn't say your life is just going to be worse. But the idea of what better means is not really very well defined. And I think personally as a Christian, I speak for myself, being changed in what I want to do is not an easy thing. And it's been a lifetime work. It's still going on. And one of the things about being a follower of Jesus that I think is really hard is that we're commanded to love people that don't love us. We're commanded to love people that don't even like us, or would see harm come to us, or if they had the means would bring the harm themselves. We're commanded to love them. Is it even possible to do such a thing? This is a really good text that seems to me to answer that question in a very direct way. So let's begin looking. Hosea chapter 2, verse 14. This is where we will begin. However, in the future, God says, I will allure Israel. I will lead her back into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. From there, I'll give her back her vineyards and turn the valley of trouble into an opportunity for hope. There she will sing as she did when she was young, when she came up from the land of Egypt. At that time, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband. You will never again call me my master. For I will remove the names of the Baal idols from your lips, so that you never again will utter those names. At that time I'll make a covenant with Israel, and with the wild animals, and the birds of the air, and the creatures that crawl on the ground. I will abolish the warrior's bow and sword. That is, every weapon of warfare will be abolished from the land, and I will allow everyone to live securely. I will commit myself to you, Israel, forever. I will commit myself to you in righteousness and justice and steadfast love and tender compassion. I'll commit myself to you in faithfulness, and then you will acknowledge the Lord. At that time I will willingly respond, declares the Lord. I will respond to the sky, and then the sky will respond to the ground. Then the ground will respond to the grain, the new wine and the olive oil, and they will respond to the decree, God plants Jezreel. Then I will plant her as my own in the land. I will have pity on no pity, lo Ruhamah. I will say to not my people, lo Ami, you are my people. And he will say, you are my God. Then the Lord said to me, go and show love to your wife again, even though she loves another man and continually commits adultery. Likewise, the Lord loves the Israelites, although they turn to other gods and offer raisin cakes to idols. So I, Hosea, paid 15 shekels of silver and 7 bushels of barley to purchase my wife back. Then I told her, you must live with me many days. You must not commit adultery or have any intimate relations with another man, and I will also wait for you. For the Israelites must live many days without a king or a prince, without sacrifice, sacred fertility pillar, without ephods or idols. Afterward, the Israelites will turn and seek the Lord their God and their Davidic king. They will submit to the Lord in fear and receive his blessings in the future. Now, this is a very complex passage, but I'm not going to focus on all of it all at once, because there are some things that I think we should focus on as we look at it. One thing is the background here, and I think the background's really important with Hosea. Who is Hosea? Well, he's a prophet to the northern kingdom. And what is it that he has been given to do? Well, he, like Ezekiel, has been turned into a living illustration of what God is going to do. And in this case, a very severe way of using him as an illustration, in my estimation, in that Hosea has been commanded by God. Now think of this. He's been commanded by God to marry a prostitute. God told him to go and marry Gomer and take her as his wife, a prostitute. And he did so. They've had children together. And look at the children. You've got a son named Jezreel, which is being named, he's being named that by God, so that everyone will remember Jehu's bloodshed. If you go to 2 Kings chapter 9, you read all about what Jehu did in purging the land and killing Jezebel and all the terrible things that took place. A lot of bloodshed in the Jezreel Valley during that period of Jehu's life. And so they named the first child Jezreel. The second child is named Lo Ruhamah, which means no pity. The third child, that's a daughter, a son, is named Lo Ami, not my people. God's got a different baby book, it seems, when it comes to these names. And we name children things that are nice, like, I don't know, flower and blossom and sunrise and whatever. We want those names to be associated with something appealing. And here God is choosing to name these children something that is the opposite of appealing, for a reason. God has given Hosea to marry someone who wouldn't appeal to a Jew especially, and yet she's his wife. Now Gomer, repeatedly, if you read the whole account, and it's worthy of reading, repeatedly goes out and seeks other lovers, stays with them, goes out, leaves Hosea wifeless and her children motherless, and goes and stays. And this is what is so striking about this, is intentional. Now, I don't know what you make of that, but this is God's will. This is an incredible story, that this is God's will. God knows who Gomer is. He knows what she's like. Hosea, the prophet's commanded to marry her. And it gets even deeper than that. This is an intentional fulfilling of God's will. Now, we read this account, and this is one of the places where the Bible becomes difficult. We read the account, and the account takes place. You can read the first 2 chapters of Hosea in 8 minutes, if you're a slow reader. 8 minutes. But this whole process, 3 children, the marriage, the adultery, this is a long period of time. These are years that are passing by here in this little short account of what's going on with Gomer and Hosea. And so we have to keep that in mind. This account makes it almost sound like, well, that's God's will, and I guess that's how it worked out, and no big deal. I mean, God's commanding all this. It's a big deal if you're Hosea. Mm-hmm. It's a big deal if you're Lo Ami and Lo Ruhamah and Jezreel, the 3 children that are left at home with no mother, and a mother that a Jew would be very ashamed of. Mm-hmm. So God has, and then poor Hosea, he's commanded to take her back over and over and over again. Now imagine you and I being chosen for this gig. I mean, what would that be like? From either a man or a woman's point of view, you're chosen to take on, you're commanded by God to marry a philanderer, a prostitute, no less. I tell you, this really puts a more severe, the only word I can think of is spin, on the idea of when I was a kid not wanting to follow Jesus because I didn't want God to send me to Africa. Well, this is a lot worse than going to Africa, it seems to me. In this prophecy, you'll find the word return used 22 times. That means something. That means that God has a plan. He wants Israel to return to him. So God lays out the plan in the little text that we read. First he says, I'm going to allure her back. Well, why does he bother to do that? Why not just make her come back, right? I'm going to command Israel to come back to me, but God doesn't do that. He allures her. And there's a reason for this. One of the arguments that people have who do not believe, they say, well, how come God didn't just tell Israel at the very beginning, and especially once Jesus was here, to just end slavery? Well, there's a very good reason for that. It wouldn't stick. It wouldn't stick. I mean, look at what happens in 40 days when the nation is gathered at the foot of Mount Sinai, when you've got the thunder and the lightning and everything else going on top of the mountain, and after 40 days, what are they doing? They're melting down all their jewelry to make a calf, so they've got a God to worship. What's going on that you can't notice what's going on up there on top of that mountain that you would even wonder whether there's a God to worship? But they do. So this is what I'm saying, is until things percolate through humanity such that we own them. That's why it took 1,800 years after Jesus for slavery to come to an end in the West, the Christian West, because it takes that long for these things. And now you look at the Christian West, there's no slavery. Hasn't been now for 170 years. The reason is it stuck because God gave it for us to do, and we did it. That's why God doesn't just command Israel to come back. He could do that, and they'd come back for a week or a month or a year or maybe a decade, and then they'd go right back to what they were before. And if you look at the history of Israel, that's absolutely true. Then God says, I will give. He's going to change the valley of Achor, the valley of trouble, into the valley of opportunity. If you go back to Joshua chapter 7 and you read the history therein where they suffered a defeat because of Achan and his family, that's the valley of Achor. He's going to return it to him. He's going to say, I'm going to make it the valley of prosperity for you. No longer the valley of trouble. Then God says, I'm going to take away. What's he going to take away? He's going to take away the idols. But he's going to do more than that. He's going to take away the desire for the idols. That's a pretty big deal. Baali means my master. And you see that in the text. God says, you'll no longer call me Baali. You will call me Ishi. You will call me my husband. That's one of the problems with idols, and it's one of the problems with paganism. The whole goal of paganism is to make sure that the deity, whoever that is, does not notice you. That's what you want. You don't want the deity to notice you, because if the deity notices you, there's going to be trouble. So what do you want? You want the deity not to pay attention. Why do you think they sacrifice children to Molech? That family does it so that my family will be spared having any attention paid to my family by Molech. We don't want that. Throw the fruit into the volcano so that the volcano god doesn't torch our village this year. I don't want to be noticed by the pagan god. Very different where God says, you're going to be my wife. I'm going to be your husband. Very different. God will take away the idols and the prostitution and be Israel's husband. Then he says, I'll betroth. And in the Jewish context, this was a big deal. This is just like being married without the fruits of marriage available to you. And there'd be all kind of wedding gifts and blessings and rituals and exchange of gifts and righteousness, justice, compassion, all the things that come along with being married to God. God will betroth to them. All of those things that Israel lacked while she was in idolatry. And then this is my favorite part. God says, I'll respond. What's he going to respond to? Well, he says, I'll speak to the heavens and they'll respond. And then the ground will respond to the heavens when the ground calls out to the heavens. And then the plants will respond to the ground when the plants call out to the ground. And God says, I'll plant. So there's this whole restoration of the entire ecosystem, the universe going on, that God's going to orchestrate. Well, God then commands Hosea to go out and retrieve his wife again. So he does. Where does he go to get her? He has to go get her from one of her lover's houses. And what's worse is, now think about what that would be like. Kids, Dad's got to go for a little while. Where are you going, Dad? Well, I'm going back to get your mom. Where's your mom? Well, she's over at some other man's house. She's been there for a while, and I've got to go get her. And worse, yeah, I guess you'd tell the kids something like this, like we do this all the time, don't we? When there's something we don't want to talk about, we say, well, Mom's busy. Well, she was busy, all right. And so you go back and get Mom and bring her home. Well, that's only half of the story. The other half is he's got to pay for her. He has to pay. He goes to get her at the lover's house, but you can't just stand there at the door and say, Joe, tell Gomer to come out. I'm taking her home. Joe says, no, you're not. How much you willing to pay for her? You can take her home if you'll pay for her. And he does. He does pay for her. And then he brings her home, and God says to Hosea, now you tell her she's got to be faithful. Well, it's not really worked up to him now. I mean, I don't know how that's going to work later on, but that's what he's told to do. So I look at this whole picture here and I say, okay, there's got to be something in here for me to learn. And I think there are. So I think there's some very obvious things that even the most dense person would it say, I've learned that. One of them is we should return to the Lord in all our ways. Well, that seems sensible. I understand that. Part of the problem with idolatry is we want to enjoy all the gifts that God gives without acknowledging the gift giver. So we engage in idolatry. We focus ourselves on the gifts with no credit given to God as the gift giver. And the gifts become everything, and God just gets forgotten in the whole thing. I mean, we're guilty of that. And then you've got Gomer. She enjoys her lover, I guess. I mean, why else would you do that? Run around on your husband and your family. And she forgets about Hosea and her children. Well, we do that. We press ourselves out there to enjoy things, and we forget about the responsibility we have to people who we care about, or we say we do. And we forget about our responsibility to be accountable to God, like Ed talked about in Sunday school this morning. But the most difficult passage for me is, and the most difficult message, I should say, of this passage is, we have to love the betrayer when we are the betrayed. That is really, really, really hard. But let's think for a minute now. Let's bring this forward 800 years and look at Jesus when he says, here's how I want you to pray. You know that we call that the Lord's Prayer. It's really the disciples' prayer. I mean, he's teaching us the template for prayer. He says, forgive us our sins as we forgive those who've sinned against us. Now, does that mean that while we're forgiving other people, that God is forgiving us? I don't think so. It seems to me it means God's going to forgive me as I will be willing to forgive others. Mm-hmm. I don't know how that shakes out, but that's how it looks to me. There seems to be a correlation between the two things. So, knowing everything we know about God, why is this so hard for us? To love the betrayer as the betrayed, which is what God's commanding us to do. Well, one thing is we have a sense of justice, and justice is offended when this happens, right? If someone betrays someone, the betrayed feel themselves offended by the betrayal. And they want justice for that. They don't want to just say, it's okay, we're still friends, or we're still a married couple, or we're still business partners, or whatever it is that has happened. No, people want to see some kind of retribution there. They want to see some contrition. They want to see something in that betrayer that says they're sorry they did this stuff. But God is real different than we are. Hosea gives us a picture of God in which you look at God and you say, clearly God needs nothing from us at all. He doesn't need anything. So Hosea then can be commanded by God to love Gomer, even though she's a prostitute and an adulteress. Over and over, he can command her to love Gomer. Why? Because love is not just a flutter of the heart at all. You know, God loves, but it's not just God feeling warm and fuzzy. It's things happening like the air is good to breathe, and there's sufficient food, and the sunlight makes the crops grow, and the seasons are regular, and our bodies, we wake up and everything works sufficiently that we can go out and make a living for ourselves, and on and on and on and on and on, that we don't wake up and all of a sudden nothing works. Mm-hmm. So that's not a flutter of God's heart. That's an action. That love is an action by God. Now think about it in terms of Hosea as an illustration. Look at the terms of Gomer's acceptance by Hosea. What are the terms? The terms are Gomer gets pursued by Hosea. She's in the adultering house. She's in the house of adultery, right? She's at the person's house. So Hosea has to pursue her. And then when he gets there, he's got to pay for her. What a picture of God. I mean, when you think about it, he pursues us. He pursued Israel. We betray him all the time, and yet he pursues us. And then he pays for us to come back. He doesn't just force us back. He gives us the opportunity to come back and says, I've made a way for you to come back. Will you come back? Holding his hands out, as he says to Israel, as Paul quotes it in the book of the letter to the Romans, holding out my hands all day to a rebellious people. Appealing to us. C.S. Lewis says this, I think, most beautifully. In his book called Surprised by Joy, which recounts his conversion from all of the things he came through, atheism, through pantheism, and everything else, to finally become a follower of Jesus. And he says this is how God took him in. This is how God accepted him. He says, kicking and screaming with my eyes darting in every direction, seeking a means of escape, the most reluctant convert in all of England. And I would add to that, with the flames of hell licking at his coattails and mine too. That's how God accepts us back. He pursues us. We don't want him. And he keeps coming, and then he goes even further and pays for us to come back. Just like Hosea paid to have his wife back in his home. Hosea became the ultimate illustration of exactly what God's love is really like. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything, you got a question for me, you want to pray with me, speak with me after the service, I'll stay as long